Hello and welcome to Cognitive Drift. Why do people believe in God? It sounds like a simple question, but the answers go deep into human psychology, culture, and even survival instincts. People often assume faith is just about tradition or morality, but it's much more than that. It's an entire system built on need, emotional, social, and cognitive needs that shaped the human experience for thousands of years. Think about the earliest humans. They lived in a world that was unpredictable, dangerous, and full of questions they couldn't answer. Lightning strikes, floods, disease, these were terrifying mysteries. And when our minds don't have answers, we create them. We're wired to look for patterns, for causes, for meaning. Because uncertainty is uncomfortable, even unbearable. If something bad happened, the human brain wanted a reason, not just a random accident, but a story that explained why. That tendency didn't go away when societies got bigger and more complex. It stayed, and belief in gods became the ultimate answer to almost everything. But why does this explanation feel so powerful? Because it speaks to the strongest human fear, the unknown. And the biggest unknown of all is death. Every living thing dies, and every conscious being eventually realizes it, that awareness brings a weight that no other animal carries. So humans looked for a way to make that burden lighter. Belief in God offered not just a creator, but a protector, a plan, and most importantly, the promise that death isn't really the end. For millions of people, that hope alone is enough to hold on to faith, no matter what evidence says. And hope is not the only factor. Belief also fulfills a social function. In early tribes, shared rituals and shared gods were tools for survival. They created unity, trust, and cooperation. When a group believed the same stories, it built a sense of us. And in a world where outsiders could be a threat, that sense of us meant safety. Religions became some of the first systems of law and order. Before governments, before courts, there were rules backed by divine authority. Break them, and you weren't just breaking a rule, you were defying a god. That's a powerful motivator when the punishment is eternal. But here's something fascinating. Our brains didn't just passively accept these ideas. They actively evolved to reinforce them. Cognitive scientists call it hyperactive agency detection. In simple terms, our minds are quick to assume intent behind events. If you hear a rustle in the bushes, it might be the wind or a predator. Assuming it's a predator keeps you alive. That survival bias made us hypersensitive to agents, beings with purpose and power. Apply that to storms, earthquakes, or life itself, and suddenly you're surrounded by invisible agents shaping your fate, gods. Now, this doesn't mean people are foolish for believing. These tendencies are natural, and in many ways they helped humanity thrive. But they also open the door for systems that exploit those instincts. Religious institutions grew massive not just because of belief, but because belief gave them leverage, control of morality, control of behavior, and often control of resources. If people are convinced their eternal soul depends on obedience, they will follow, even sacrifice. History is full of wars, crusades, and persecutions driven by this power dynamic. Yet people rarely see it that way, because the idea of divine will makes those actions feel justified. What's more interesting is how belief persists even when explanations improve. Today we know why thunder happens. We understand disease, earthquakes, eclipses. But removing the mystery doesn't remove the need for meaning. Science can explain the how, but the why. Why there's something instead of nothing. Why life exists. Those questions don't vanish. And for many, God remains the easiest placeholder for everything unknown. It's a mental shortcut that feels satisfying even if it doesn't solve the problem. And then there's morality. A lot of people believe in God because they think morality needs him. Without a divine lawgiver, they fear everything becomes meaningless. If there's no God, what stops us from killing each other? But morality isn't a divine gift. It's a social adaptation. Cooperation and empathy helped humans survive. Groups that work together thrive more than groups that didn't. And if we're together, we get to be together. Over time, Behaviors like fairness, loyalty, and compassion became part of our psychology because they worked. You don't need eternal punishment to know that hurting others damages trust and stability. We build morality the same way we build language, through evolution, experience, and culture. There's also the emotional factor, maybe the biggest factor of all. Life is full of suffering. People lose loved ones, face injustice, deal with pain that feels unbearable. In those moments, belief can feel like the only relief. The idea that everything happens for a reason can soothe the chaos of reality. And who wouldn't want that comfort? It doesn't make the belief true, but it makes it deeply appealing. When the human brain weighs logic against emotional survival, emotion usually wins. But here's something that rarely gets discussed. Belief isn't just about comfort or fear. It's about identity. For many people, faith is who they are. It's family, culture, community. To question it feels like betraying your roots. That's why changing beliefs is so hard. It's not just changing ideas, it's tearing out a piece of yourself. And because humans are wired to avoid cognitive dissonance, we often cling harder to beliefs when they're challenged. It's less about evidence and more about preserving a sense of self. So why do people believe in God? Because it answers questions we hate to leave open. Because it gives comfort when life hurts. Because it binds people together. Because our brains are built to see patterns, purpose, and agents behind every shadow. These forces are so deep that even when knowledge expands, they don't disappear. And maybe that's the real insight. Belief in God isn't a flaw or a failure. It's a byproduct of being human. But understanding why we believe can be the first step toward seeing the world as it truly is. A world that might not have a plan, but still has endless meaning we create for ourselves. But here's the paradox. Even when people start doubting, belief often doesn't vanish overnight. It clings. Why? Because faith isn't only about truth, it's about trust, belonging, and security. Pull one thread and you risk unraveling your entire sense of stability. That's why people often compartmentalize. They might accept evolution in science class, yet still pray for guidance. It feels safer to hold on to some certainty than to step into the unknown completely. This is where cognitive biases play a massive role. One of the strongest is confirmation bias. The tendency to notice and remember things that support what we already believe. If someone prays for healing and recovers, they call it a miracle. If they pray and nothing changes, they say it's God's will. Either way, the belief survives. This flexibility makes religious ideas almost immune to contradiction. Every outcome becomes evidence, which means the belief is never at risk. Compare that to how science works, where failure disproves a theory. In religion, failure reinforces faith. Another bias is pattern seeking. Our brains hate randomness, so we invent order even where none exists. That's why people see faces in clouds or meaning in coincidences. Hear two songs in a row that share a word like heaven, and it can feel like a sign. These experiences feel deeply personal and profound, so people interpret them as proof of the divine. But they're just the brain doing what it always does, connecting dots, even when the picture isn't real. Now let's look at something rarely discussed, how belief adapts. When old explanations collapse, new ones take their place. Ancient people thought gods moved the sun, now believers say God set the laws of physics. This is what philosophers call the God of the gaps, filling in mysteries with divine action. The problem, those gaps keep shrinking as knowledge grows. 1,000 years ago, almost everything was a gap. Today, fewer and fewer mysteries need supernatural answers. But for many, that doesn't weaken faith, it just pushes God further into abstraction. Instead of a deity throwing lightning bolts, God becomes the reason for existence or the source of morality. In other words, as evidence erodes the old images, belief evolves to stay alive. What's interesting is that this evolution reveals something crucial. Faith isn't about evidence, it's about need. Because if it were evidence-driven, every scientific breakthrough would reduce belief dramatically. Instead, global surveys show religion often remains strong even in highly educated societies. Why? Because belief isn't competing with science on the same playing field. It's offering something science doesn't: emotional security and existential comfort. You can explain how stars form, but that doesn't hold your hand when you're scared of dying. And that brings us to one of the deepest reasons people believe: fear of non-existence. Try for a moment to picture the end of consciousness. No awareness, no memory, no time. It's almost impossible to imagine because your mind can't experience its own absence. That mental blind spot fuels the yearning for eternity. For many, it feels unbearable to think that life, everything they are, every relationship, every dream, will simply end. So belief becomes a shield against that fear, a promise that the story doesn't stop. It's not about logic. It's about survival of the psyche. But fear of death isn't the only fear at play. There's also fear of meaninglessness. If there's no higher power, then the universe is indifferent and everything we do ultimately fades. For some, that thought feels crushing. Yet here's the irony. People assume meaning must be given from outside, that it has to come from a divine source. But meaning isn't handed down, it's built from within. The love you share, the art you create, the lives you touch, these aren't illusions. They're real, and they matter precisely because they're temporary. The sunset is beautiful because it doesn't last forever. In a strange way, letting go of cosmic purpose makes human purpose even more precious. Of course, not everyone sees it that way, and that's because belief isn't just a personal choice, it's reinforced by entire social systems. From birth, most people are surrounded by a framework that treats faith as the default. Families, traditions, rituals, holidays, all woven into identity. It's like language. You don't choose your native tongue, you inherit it. And questioning it feels unnatural, even threatening. That's why so many people believe the religion they were born into is the truth. Statistically, if you'd been born elsewhere, you'd probably believe something else entirely. That fact alone says a lot about how belief works. But society doesn't just teach faith, it rewards it. In many places, being religious signals trustworthiness. Politicians openly declare faith to gain votes. Celebrities thank God on stage. Meanwhile, openly rejecting belief can bring judgment, even hostility. That social cost keeps many people silent about doubts. In fact, studies show that in some countries, atheists are among the least trusted minorities, not because they've done harm, but because the stereotype says morality comes from religion, which, as we've seen, isn't true, but perception often matters more than reality. And this is where the power dynamics of religion really show. Faith isn't just personal, it's political. When belief ties into law, education, and governance, it shapes entire societies. Leaders have long understood that controlling belief is one of the strongest tools for controlling behavior. If people think laws are divine commands, they'll obey without question. If they think leaders rule by God's will, they'll submit even to injustice. History shows this pattern again and again, from ancient empires to modern states. It's not a conspiracy, it's human nature. Use the deepest fears and hopes people have, and you can move nations. But why doesn't belief collapse when people encounter contradictions or overwhelming evidence against it? That's where our psychology plays its strongest card: confirmation bias. We look for information that supports what we already believe, and we ignore or explain away anything that threatens it. This isn't unique to religion, but when the belief is tied to identity and fear of eternal punishment, the bias becomes nearly unbreakable. If someone's entire sense of meaning depends on God being real, they will bend reality before they let that go. Another factor is what psychologists call motivated reasoning. People don't start neutral and then weigh the evidence. They start with a conclusion, God exists, and then search for reasons to justify it. Any counter-argument gets reframed as a test of faith, or worse, as a trick from an enemy. That's why debates about religion rarely change minds. When someone feels their core belief is under attack, the rational brain shuts down and the defensive brain takes over. And here's something even more fascinating. For many believers, doubt is not an obstacle to faith, it's part of it. Some traditions even frame doubt as a sign of true devotion, because you're resisting temptation. So when evidence piles up, believers don't see it as proof against their view. They see it as a challenge they must overcome to strengthen their faith. That mental loop is almost impossible to break because the system defends itself from the inside. Now let's talk about control, not in the conspiratorial sense, but in the practical sense. Religion historically offered stability in chaotic societies. That stability often came through hierarchy. Priests, clergy, imams, and other authorities became gatekeepers of ultimate truth. If you control what happens to people after they die, you control how they live. And that power was and still is enormous. Governments allied with churches, kings claimed divine right, wars were fought under holy banners. Even today, religious influence shapes laws on marriage, education, healthcare, and personal freedoms in many countries. When a belief system holds that its rules come from an all-knowing, all-powerful being, questioning those rules feels impossible for most people. But control isn't just external, it's internal. Guilt and fear are built into many doctrines. From the moment someone is told they were born sinful and that their thoughts can condemn them, the stage is set for self-surveillance. The idea that a divine being reads your mind 24/7 creates a level of psychological pressure no human authority could ever match. And what happens when you believe your eternal fate depends on perfect obedience? You don't just follow the rules, you police yourself and others. That's how belief sustains itself across generations without needing constant force. It's like a self-replicating code running in human minds. But why does this matter in the modern world where science and technology have transformed almost every part of life? Because progress doesn't erase fear. We might understand germs and galaxies, but we still fear pain, suffering, and death. And as long as those fears exist, belief will find a home. In fact, research shows that in times of crisis, war, poverty, pandemics, religious belief often rises, even in secular societies. When life feels fragile, people look for anchors, and God is the ultimate anchor. That's why you can have scientists who understand evolution completely, yet still pray every night. Knowledge doesn't fully replace the emotional weight of hope. And this brings us to an uncomfortable truth. Belief in God often survives not because it explains reality better, but because it feels better. The promise that life has purpose, that justice will prevail, that loved ones are not truly gone. Those ideas soothe a deep ache in the human condition. The alternative, that the universe is indifferent, that death is final, can feel unbearable, and so even when someone doubts, they might cling to belief as a kind of emotional life raft. Psychologists call this terror management, the strategies we use to cope with the awareness of mortality. Religion is the most elaborate version of that coping mechanism humanity has ever built. But here's the twist. For many people, belief isn't even about God anymore. It's about belonging. Faith communities provide connection in an increasingly disconnected world. They offer rituals, shared stories, and a sense of being part of something bigger. That social glue can be hard to replace. In fact, when people leave religion, the hardest part isn't losing God, it's losing the people, the traditions, the feeling of home. That's why, even in secular societies, we see new movements trying to fill that gap, with communities built on shared values instead of shared deities. So, if belief in God is this deeply rooted, is it even possible for humanity to move beyond it? History suggests the answer is complicated. Religion adapts, it rebrands, reinterprets, softens its claims. It trades miracles for metaphors, dogma for dialogue. But the core appeal, meaning, comfort, identity, doesn't vanish. That's why arguments based purely on evidence rarely dismantle faith, because belief was never just about evidence in the first place. It's about what it gives people emotionally and socially. The real challenge then is this: can humans find meaning without myths? Can we face a universe without a script and still feel that life matters? Many thinkers say yes. They argue that meaning isn't discovered, it's created. We give value to our lives through relationships, creativity, curiosity, and compassion. A sunset doesn't need a divine painter to be beautiful. Love doesn't need eternity to matter. And justice, though imperfect, can still be worth fighting for, even if no cosmic judge guarantees it. In a way, this perspective is harder because it puts the responsibility on us. But it's also more honest and maybe more empowering, because if life has no pre-written meaning, then every moment we live is an opportunity to write our own. There's another reason belief is so resilient: beauty. Many people are drawn to religion not just for answers, but for aesthetics. The music of a choir, the architecture of a cathedral, the rhythm of prayer. These things feel profound. They stir something in us because humans respond to pattern, harmony, and ritual. That emotional response is often mistaken for evidence. If standing in a temple gives you chills, it feels like the presence of the divine. A beauty doesn't need a god to exist. A sunrise, a symphony, or a poem can move us the same way, no supernatural cause required. The feeling is real, but the source is human creativity. Now, let's talk about the trade-off between faith and doubt. Doubt is hard. It takes work. When you step away from ready-made answers, you face questions with no guarantees. Why are we here? What happens after death? For a lot of people, that uncertainty feels like standing on the edge of a cliff with no safety rail. Faith, on the other hand, is the safety rail, even if it's an illusion. It tells you someone is in control, that life is fair in the end, that your suffering has a purpose. These promises are so powerful that many people choose certainty over truth, even when they suspect the certainty is false. And honestly, that's understandable. Comfort can feel more urgent than accuracy when life gets painful. But here's the cost. When you outsource meaning to an external authority, you risk giving up your autonomy. You stop asking your own questions because the answers are already settled. You might even accept harmful ideas because rejecting them feels like rejecting the entire system. History is full of examples. From bans on scientific discoveries to moral rules that caused real harm, when a belief claims absolute truth, it doesn't just shape individual lives. It shapes entire cultures, sometimes in ways that hold humanity back. That's why it matters to understand this dynamic. Even if you personally don't believe, still the story of belief isn't just about control or fear. It's also about longing. Humans long for justice, love, permanence, things the world rarely gives us fully. Religion takes those longings and turns them into promises. A perfect judge who rights every wrong, a love that never ends, a life that doesn't die. It's easy to see why that vision is irresistible. It speaks to the deepest parts of what makes us human. But longing for something doesn't make it real. And in some ways, chasing an afterlife can distract from the one life we know we have. If you believe paradise is waiting, you might tolerate injustice now. You might accept suffering instead of fighting to change it. That trade-off is enormous and often invisible to those who make it. Here's something else rarely mentioned. Belief often persists because of habit. People grow up hearing the same prayers, repeating the same words, attending the same rituals. Over time, the practice feels like truth simply because it's familiar. Psychologists call this the mere exposure effect. We trust what we know. And faith communities reinforce that by rewarding compliance and discouraging doubt. If every friend, every family member, every role model you have believes, walking away feels like stepping into exile. For many, it's easier to stay than to face that isolation. Now consider this. When people do walk away, it's often not because of arguments, but because of experience. A tragedy that makes them question divine goodness, hypocrisy from leaders who preached virtue, or simply the slow realization that they don't actually believe, even if they want to. But even then, letting go is hard because belief isn't just in the mind, it's in the body. Rituals, habits, reflex prayers, they become automatic. Unlearning them can take years. And for some, the fear never fully leaves. That's how deep these systems run. So why does all this matter? Because understanding belief isn't just an intellectual exercise, it helps us understand ourselves. The need for answers, for comfort, for connection, those aren't weaknesses, they're part of being human. Religion has been one way to meet those needs, but not the only way. Today, we can choose meaning without mythology, morality without dogma, and purpose without promises we can't verify. That path isn't always easy. Uncertainty rarely is, but it's honest. And in that honesty, there's a different kind of peace. A peace that doesn't depend on illusions, but on the strength to face reality as it is. Fleeting, fragile, and full of possibilities. Life without a cosmic plan might sound small at first, but think about it. If this is the only life we have, then every moment matters more, not less. Every act of kindness, every friendship, every piece of art becomes infinitely valuable because it won't last forever. Meaning isn't written in the stars. It's written in what we do while we're here. That truth can feel daunting, but it's also liberating because if no one else is writing the story, then the pen is in your hands. And that in its own way is more powerful than any God. One of the most common arguments for belief is Pascal's wager. It goes like this. If God exists and you believe, you gain everything, eternal life. If God doesn't exist, you lose nothing. But if you don't believe and God does exist, you lose everything. At first glance, that sounds clever, but look closer. The wager assumes there's only one possible God and one correct way to believe. What about all the other gods people have worshipped throughout history? Which one should you bet on? If the wrong choice leads to the same eternal punishment, the wager collapses. And beyond that, belief isn't a button you can press. You can't force yourself to believe something just because it's safer. At best, you'd be pretending. And if God values sincerity, that won't work either. So the wager is less about truth and more about fear, and fear isn't a solid foundation for reality. Another popular argument is design, the idea that the universe is too complex to exist by chance. People point to the fine-tuning of physics, the intricacy of DNA, the beauty of life. It feels intuitive that such order must come from a mind, but intuition isn't evidence. Complexity can arise from simple rules applied over time. That's what evolution shows us. And when people say the universe is perfectly tuned for life, they forget something. If the conditions weren't right for life, we wouldn't be here to notice. That's not design, that's survivorship bias. And even if the universe were designed, that doesn't prove the existence of any specific God. It just pushes the question back one step: who designed the designer? These arguments sound convincing because they appeal to emotion and wonder, but they don't solve the underlying mysteries. They just rename them. And that brings us to the God of the gaps, filling every unanswered question with divine action. Don't know what caused lightning? Must be Zeus. Don't know why plagues happen? God's punishment. Today we know those answers. Electricity and germs, but the pattern persists. People say we don't know what caused the Big Bang. It must be God. But history shows that as knowledge expands, those gaps shrink. Belief built on gaps is always temporary. Every mystery solved without divine intervention makes God less necessary, not more. Which means if faith depends on ignorance, it's standing on fragile ground. Now let's look at something more subtle, the shift from religion to spirituality. Many people today say they're spiritual, but not religious. They reject organized institutions but still believe in some higher power, some force or energy guiding life. Why? Because the psychological needs behind belief haven't gone away. People still crave meaning, transcendence, connection to something bigger than themselves. Spirituality offers that without the strict rules or hierarchies of traditional religion, it feels more personal, less dogmatic. But the core dynamic is similar. It fills the gaps of uncertainty with comforting ideas, even if those ideas can't be tested or verified. This trend shows that belief isn't disappearing, it's adapting to modern values like individual freedom and skepticism of authority. And here's another angle. For some, belief isn't about explanations at all, it's about morality. They worry that without God, everything becomes permissible. But history and psychology tell a different story. Morality evolved because it helped communities survive. Cooperation, fairness, empathy, these traits made life possible long before any written scripture. In fact, we see moral behavior in species with no religion at all. Elephants mourning their dead, primates showing fairness, dolphins protecting each other. Our sense of right and wrong isn't etched by a divine hand. It's rooted in our nature as social beings. And here's the kicker. When people think morality depends on God, it can backfire. They may start believing that without divine punishment, nothing matters. But morality matters because of its real-world consequences. Because kindness builds trust. because justice creates stability, because empathy reduces suffering. Those truths stand whether or not the universe has a ruler. Still, even when logic dismantles these arguments, belief often remains untouched. Why? Because the function of belief isn't primarily logical, it's existential. It gives people a story where they matter in a vast, indifferent cosmos. It promises that love never dies, that pain has a purpose, that justice wins in the end. These are powerful narratives, and to let them go feels like stepping into chaos. That's why, when people finally do leave faith, it's rarely because of a single argument. It's because they reach a point where the cost of staying outweighs the fear of leaving. Sometimes that happens after years of quiet questioning, sometimes after a single moment of clarity, but always, it takes courage to replace certainty with curiosity. So why does any of this matter? Because understanding belief isn't about winning arguments or proving people wrong. It's about understanding ourselves. When we see why humans believe in gods, we see the forces that shape our fears, our hopes, and our identities. We see how deeply we crave certainty, how much we long for connection, how far we'll go to make sense of a world that often feels senseless. And when we see that, something important happens. We stop thinking of belief as a mystery and start seeing it as a mirror reflecting the very things that make us human. But here's the real question. If the universe doesn't have a plan, can life still have meaning? The answer is yes, but it's a different kind of meaning. It's not handed down from above. It's created from within, and that makes it fragile, but also powerful. Because if no one writes the script for us, then every choice we make, every kindness we show, every bit of beauty we create, it all matters because we chose it. Not because it was commanded, not because it earns a reward, but because it's who we decided to be. That's not emptiness, that's freedom. Think about what that means. If this is the only life we have, then time becomes more precious, not less. Every sunrise, every laugh, every shared moment carries weight because it won't happen again. We don't need eternity to make life meaningful, we need presence. And that shift from seeking meaning in an imagined future to creating meaning here and now is profound. It takes away the illusion of permanence. But in exchange, it gives us urgency. It reminds us that what we do today matters, because today is all we truly own. And maybe that's the most honest kind of hope. Not that the universe is watching over us, but that we can watch over each other. Not that justice is guaranteed in some cosmic courtroom, but that we can fight for it here. Not that love lasts forever in some other world, but that we can make it matter fiercely in this one. In the end, the absence of a divine plan doesn't make life less significant. It makes it entirely ours. And that, in a way, is more awe-inspiring than any miracle. Because it means the meaning of life isn't waiting to be found. It's waiting to be made. So the next time someone asks why people believe in God, the answer isn't simple and it isn't foolishness. It's human. It's the story of a species trying to survive uncertainty, conquer fear, and hold on to hope. And even if we choose not to believe, understanding that story can make us more compassionate, more curious, and maybe even more free. Because once we stop searching for answers in the heavens, we can start building them here, together, on the only world we know, in the only life we have,